Today, I'm really excited for this episode. And this is one of the episodes that I wanted to do over and over again. It's a good idea before listening to this episode, if you are one of my own audiences, to maybe go back on the blog and have a review of the introduction to this specific episode before we jump in. My guest today has published more than 35 books, over 200 articles, and is the past president of the American Philosophical Association, the Central Division, the North American Society for Social Philosophy, past president of Concerned Philosophers for Peace, and past presidents for the International Association for Philosophy of Law and Social Philosophy, the American section. James Sterba, known for his work in ethics and political philosophy, as I'm sure most people listening would know, and now for philosophy of religion. So thank you, Jim, for being with us.
I'm happy to be here.
Great. Let's start from the first thing, which is my own habit of asking how people end up in philosophy. So because in my experience, when I talk to philosophers, I rarely find someone who says this has been my intention from the start. So how did you end up in philosophy?
Well, if I hadn't entered a religious order, the Christian Brothers, Catholic religious order, at age 14, this would never have happened, because I was going to go to college. I was going to be an engineer. My father was not an engineer, but he was always interested in building things and fixing things. I had the same thing. So when I joined the religious order at 14, they don't do that anymore in America these days, but they did then. Religion and theology and philosophy just became dominant in my thinking. And I stayed in that religious order. Last 3 years, I was teaching in high school, teaching English literature and religion. I stayed in until I was 26, just before final vows. And what I realized was I was not cut out to be a high school teacher. And this order was all about high school teaching. So I realized I had to leave, and just before final vows was a good point. So I started now, I guess I could have gone on. I still was a believer then. I could have gone on in theology, but I chose philosophy, and I chose moral and political philosophy because I wanted the philosophy I was most focused on to have some practical input. So that set my career in moral and political philosophy, doing my graduate work at the University of Pittsburgh, and then accepting the job at the University of Notre Dame. I could have gone to McGill University in Montreal. Those were my two main offers, but I thought staying in the States was a good idea. So now I didn't turn to philosophy of religion until very recently. And what happened there was I just completed what was my last book in political philosophy at the time. It was 2013. And I thought, what am I going to do now? Didn't know. So then I got this idea of bringing moral and political philosophy to the problem of evil. Now, being at Notre Dame, there's lots of discussions of the problem of evil going on all this conference. I was sort of listening to them a bit. And what I began to see was that people working in this area were primarily metaphysicians and logicians, not moral and political philosophers. So I thought I had something to offer here. So I took the idea to the Templeton Foundation. I said, would you be interested I think I could bring some untapped resources. At least we could raise the question, are there untapped resources in ethics and political philosophy that were relevant to the problem of evil? And they liked the idea. And I wasn't actually sure how this was going to go then. And so they allowed me to have a couple conferences, bring the experts into Notre Dame to lecture, and then give me time off to work on a book project myself. So that started me off. And I still didn't know where that was going to go. I was a little surprised that the people I brought in were a little reluctant to talk about how ethics applied to the problem of evil. Particularly what I wanted them to focus on was what in political philosophy, it's the Pauline principle. Never do evil that good may come of it. And I predicted, so how does this apply to the problem of evil? And I didn't get a lot of, I kept pushing and they kept resisting. And I thought maybe something's going on here, so I better keep looking at this. And so it took a while, but eventually I came up with the argument in my book, which is basically an argument the God of traditional theism, the all-good, all-powerful God, is logically incompatible with all the evil in the world, particularly if you were talking about the horrendous evil in the world. So that's how it's a long transition there from religious order to atheist. My commitment to the atheism here is just as strong as this argument. If somebody knocks a fatal hole in the argument, I'm no longer an atheist.
Great. And such should be the defeasible viewpoint of every philosopher, of course. What is the change from the time that you published your book? You said there was some sort of reluctance to engage and allow these considerations from ethics to play out in the argument from evil and the logical argument. So what has changed in this? I know this is a relatively short time, but what has changed, which is most significantly stands out for you?
Well, I mean, there's a change in my own research on this. So I just saw some problems initially, and I didn't have an argument yet, an argument against the existence of God. I just saw unanswered questions, and the book is sort of a journey in that process. It's not, in some sense, it has a problem because it's that. Because I didn't have the argument set from the very beginning. I was kind of building toward it chapter by chapter. And only by about chapter 6 did I have the components. And it was only in the conclusion where I finally put them together. So it was a process. That was a process for me. But the process for philosophy of religion is more stark in a way. What happened in philosophy of religion, and it happened while I was at Notre Dame, was that there was this debate or discussion between John Mackey and Alvin Plantinga. Mackey, of course, was the Oxford guy. He was, the power, the authority, and he claimed to have an argument that showed God was logically impossible. Now, he didn't have it fully set out. He sort of initially, and then he did sort of put the premises out there. And Alvin Plantinga took a look at it, and he kind of, I think, drove a truck right through the argument. I mean, and he just knocked it down in such a way as Mackey almost had to admit he was defeated, and almost what happened at that time was that atheists kind of gave up the game to try to come up with a logical argument again. And what they tried to do, they call evidential argument. It was basically probabilistic. They would show God was unlikely. And William Rowe kind of led this charge. He was an atheist that said, well, Plantinga's right. We don't have a logical argument against God, but we do have, he thinks, an evidential argument. And so that's been going on right up to the present moment. In fact, probably if you took a survey of atheist philosophers, and certainly a survey of theist philosophers, that there is no logical argument against the existence of God. So now I come on the scene and say, I've got one. So now I've been getting kind of a hearing. It's a little reluctance at different times, but I got this author meets critics session on the book, which was really good. In fact, I think what enabled me, well, I don't know how, there was a couple theists that were really willing to give me a shot at this. I think they saw my sincerity, and they were willing to go. One person was really crucial to get the author meets critics session at the meeting of the Society for Philosophy of Religion. It was the editor at that meeting who saw the way I was approaching it, particularly the point I just made a bit ago, that I'm only an atheist because of this argument. Knock a hole in the argument. And so he thought that he didn't think atheists were like this. So he said he actually then he got the series, the thing published in his journal. And then the other thing was, one of the people was the very, very good theist, very good argues very well, William Hasker. He wasn't satisfied. So we actually had it afterwards, another round, which is also published in the journal. And it's all very good. And Hasker finally is in the first religion special issue too. He's come back again. And at that point, we actually had reached an agreement on a very important issue. We might get to it later. So this discussion has been really helpful for me to kind of sort out where I have to say more. I've seen that, and I'm still. I think this next time with this next special issue, somebody, if anybody's going to knock it down, it's going to happen in that special issue. There's just so many good people I've got in there. Theists and atheists, they're all after me. They're all trying to say this doesn't work. Because look, think about it from the atheist point of view. If you're been an atheist for a long while and you've been arguing that all you've got is this probabilistic argument, and then somebody comes on and says, no, there's this logical argument, which in some sense is like a better argument. You don't have to have any, you don't have to have this empirical probabilistic evidence. Well, then you've been wrong for 20 years. I mean, you don't want that. So you're going to fight hard. And I've got some atheists in there who really are going to push hard to try to say, no, this argument doesn't work. So I'm a pariah to both houses. Right?
That is certainly true. And I have to say that I actually reached out to a bunch of philosophers of religion and asking them, what are your thoughts prior to doing this? What are your thoughts on just the logical problem of evil? Because throughout the literature, it just has been assumed that, as you said, that we have to just move on to evidential arguments because the logical argument was solved. Now, one person, and the earliest account of which I think was voiced by Graham Oppy, who said, actually, contrary to what has been said, the rumors of the death of the logical problem of evil have been exaggerated. The next person that I talked to was Liz Jackson. And Liz Jackson had this to say. And she said, I'm quoting her, so essentially Plantinga is right that the logical problem of evil doesn't prove with 100% certainty that there is a contradiction within the traditional concept of the God. However, I think the bar was set too high for the logical problem of evil to begin with. Philippe Leon also, whose work I adore, said that I think the logical problem of evil as set out by Jim Sterba and the new logical problem of evil by Schellenberg haven't been solved, but if you want to say that Mackey's version has been solved, I think I can agree with you there. This is a paraphrase of what he said. It's not a complete quote. I also asked Tyrone Goldschmidt, and Tyrone Goldschmidt said, I think I will endorse the same kind of healthy skepticism that Graham Oppy says, and Tyrone Goldschmidt is a theist. And I also asked Michael Almeida, and Michael Almeida said, I still think logical arguments are great. I think they are strong, and there remains work to be done on it. But he says that I have in one of his works, he says that I think Mackey's argument has been more or less solved, and he has some reservations about your argument too. But you're right, there seems to be a change, but a resistance from it too. So one of the people who was resisting your take on it was also Laura Ekström, one of the evidential camp.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I've tried to. She is in that special issue, the first special issue, and I responded to her there, and I wanted to have further argument with her, but she's very busy right now. So I invited her to the second special issue, but she wasn't able to do that, and so I've laid out why. Well, what she was trying to do was initially saying, well, my argument is just like her argument is just like my argument. So we're not. Well, but of course, then, well, what is it? Is her argument an evidential argument? I think it is. Well, then mine must be an evidence. No, so I tried to sort out the difference there, but I haven't been able to kind of push her on that to have a clarity there. I really would have liked that, but people have their lives to live, and they can't always do everything you want when you want it to be done. So eventually, I think we'll have an exchange about that. The other people, there's some. have to, I don't know if I should do this or not, but Graham Oppy, I owe a lot to him. My book is published because in Palgrave because of him. He saw that there was merit to my argument. And in fact, if you look at the back of the book, there's an endorsement there from him. So, it was very hard going to publishers with this book project, where most of the reviewers are theists. Maybe they're trying to be fair, but it's hard for them to see good arguments on the other side. Now, maybe it's that the binder's the other way too, but it's been difficult, and but I keep working at it because I want the argument out there, and so if they don't see it this way, maybe if I put it a little differently, they'll see it. So it's a struggle there. I'm hoping to make progress on it.
So one thing I just wanted to add, and then we will get going, is that at least one way that I found to motivate this project from a theistic point of view is, look, obviously, if you want to have a good theist, a good Thomistic theist who is sincere and has changed his mind on that, then obviously you can look at Jim's Sterba. So the fact that a theist has taken this seriously shows that other theists should take this seriously too.
That may be. I do have a pedigree here. Not too many atheists have been in religious order for 12 years. So you're right. Although I did meet one recent, just another person who claimed he's going to now contribute. Oh, this was a very interesting thing. I invited, what is his name? I think it's Hickman. I forgot his first name. He's up in Canada at Trent University. I sent an invitation for the second special issue. And he wrote back to me that just that day, he had told his partner that, he's been thinking about the problem of evil for 30 years, and he's been defending the theist side, and he's decided it doesn't work. And so my invitation just comes in the door just at that time, and he says, yes, I want to write on this. So he had some religious background too. I don't think quite as much as mine, but we did share some things there. So yeah, I don't know what happens there. I'm trying to, because this is part of my background. I want to be really fair to it. It's part of me. So I'm trying my best to listen to people, and when they seem to disagree, and I don't see why, I will go after them and say, can we talk more about it? And I'm still looking for things. And there was a very interesting experience that happened at Princeton after the Princeton debate. It happened with but Rubio was the debater. But that argument, that's the argument that God is not a moral agent. But there is the person that invited me to the debate. He raised a question in the question and answer thing, and I thought I answered it. Then I said, well, let's have a Zoom meeting and talk more about it. And we had the Zoom meeting, and I thought I answered it then. And then I thought about it some more, and I thought, I haven't worked out an answer to this. This is a problem for my argument. This is the first time this is a real problem. And so then I kept thinking about it, and I came up with an answer. So then we had another session on it or something, and I told him and now it's all, basically, this is kind of why it eluded me initially. Usually on the problem of evil, if you took, for example, Tully's approach, he's not even kind of willing to give the theist the afterlife. You have to give the theist the afterlife. It's not going to work this out if they have. So there has been a kind of reluctance. You see that back with William Rowe. He talks about sort of thick theism or thin theism, and he finally he actually thinks, well, you get the thick, you put the afterlife in there, and his argument's gone. So I think you better have an argument that embraces the afterlife. But this this guy at Princeton took it further, and it basically was drawing on Marilyn Adams in a way that they made it clear what was going on. It basically said, well, what about putting the incarnation redemption into the thing? So
before getting to that,
we're getting to that. Okay, maybe we're going too far. Yeah.
Let's go back a bit.
Okay, sure enough.
Okay, so Mackey comes along and states and prints and publishes his version of the logical argument from evil, and then we have the response from Plantinga. So first of all, walk us through that history up until the point of the free will defense, and then we will take it from there.
Well, basically, what Mackey needed to get his argument going, and he knew it was some necessary moral or metaphysical principles. And he finally coughed up a couple, and it was something a good being prevents all the evil it can, and I forgot what the other one was. And when you think about those principles, they're not always true even for human beings. I mean, and so it really was. It was a failure from the get-go. I don't know how he even thought that these would work. And Plantinga saw that. And I mean, this is, in one sense, this is how Plantinga's argument works. I mean, we all recognize that there's some evils we would permit in order to get a greater good. I mean, parents do that all the time. Maybe their kids are fighting and somebody's getting the worst of it, but not too bad. And you don't intervene, and you see what they're going to do. And so they actually come through that and learn. Now, if it gets worse, they're going to really hurt the person seriously, then the parent should come in and intervene. But that kind of permitting evil, some evil, is part of our understanding of morality. Well, then obviously it should be part of God's too. I mean, so the whole idea that God would permit some evil in the world, it's a no-brainer. Of course, we permit some evil in the world, and we think it's a good thing. So of course God would do it. So in one sense, the Plantinga thing was obvious. What Plantinga then did try to do, though, was to extend the argument further, that God would permit all the evil in the world. And that's where the free will defense won't get you. It can get you, sure, the freedom of people to kind of fight things out is a good thing, as long as not too much evil is being done. But if it's going to be serious evil, someone's going to be seriously assaulted, someone's going to be raped, I mean, that's where, in human context, if you can, you want intervention. And so Plantinga needed a further argument there. Freedom alone. See, another way to put this is there's the freedom of the actor, the evildoer, and there's the freedom of the victim. And when the freedom of the actor is given paramount, the freedom of the victim is crushed. So from a point of view of freedom, it's a loss. I mean, you lost a significant freedom, the more important freedom, and you gave way to a more trivial freedom, the freedom of the wrongdoer to do some horrendous deed. That's not a freedom they should have. So even in terms of freedom, the whole thing morally doesn't work. And so Plantinga gets the small concession that sure, some evil is compatible with God, with a good person, as it's compatible with a good person, it's compatible with God. But what we need is all the evil, particularly all the horrendous evil, and whether that's compatible with God. That's the argument Plantinga never got to.
And also, let me just reiterate here that Jim is not saying that there won't be other possible reasons that do not have to do with this sort of freedom that can change things. His main focus, as I understand it, is just, look, if you're talking about freedom as a greater good, I'm telling you that the free will defense is not enough, at least. More needs to be said. Do I have that correctly?
I got that exactly. That's how the argument of the book proceeds. And then the question is there this other good, maybe not freedom, that could be a God justifier for the permission of evil? That's what the book keeps trying to work out and then the end says no. there isn't such good. Yeah.
So one of these goods that could be a candidate is the soul making.
Yes.
Of Adam, for example. So you retrospectively look at your an experience that you have, maybe a friendship with someone you had, maybe some sort of talent that you have developed, and there were significant hardships in your way in developing that. But when you look back and you see the good that has come out of it, or in a theistic terminology, the fact that you are now get to experience the highest form of good, that is to be in companion with God and the beatific vision and so on, should give you some sort of reason that this you won't want to wish away your talent or wish away your achievements, this even though you have had the suffering. And so it seems to me that at least this is one of the candidates that could put forward the idea for this. So what's wrong with this?
Well, you actually mentioned a couple goods there that could be candidates. One is kind of soul making, the virtue, the goods of soul making, and having those is important. We should tolerate the permission of evil for those. But then you also mentioned companionship with God. Friendship with God. Let me just deal with the friendship with God one before the soul-making one. So the friendship with God, this was a crucial insight for my argument. So this is often used as this is great good, friendship with God. And so that's the kind of greatest good we can imagine. So maybe evil, the permission of evil is necessary for friendship. And the argument there, it can't be. Why? Because God can't just give you his friendship. He gives you an opportunity to be friends with him. That's what he can do. He can give you an opportunity to be friends with him. And here's the interesting point. If God must be free to give that opportunity of friendship to anybody. So it can't be that he can only give that opportunity for friendship if some people have suffered horrendous evil. That would put a condition on God's freedom to give his friendship, the opportunity for his friendship. He must be completely free about that, or he's constrained about giving his friendship. Now, there is a little constraint about giving his friendship, I want to say. I mean, God cannot offer his friendship to somebody, say, who's a child molester. I mean, that's a moral constraint. And what that means is, as long as the person's committed to being a child molester, God cannot offer his friendship. But if the person changes their ways and it repents, then of course God could give him the opportunity for friendship. So there is kind of some moral constraints on what God could offer, when God could offer friendship. But outside of that, he can't be constrained. Well, he has to permit horrendous evil or he can't offer his friendship. That would be a constraint on the all-powerful God. Can't be. So that takes that good off. It's a really important that the opportunity to be friends with God is not something that could be used as a justifier for the evil in the world. Now, soul-making can be. Usually here, in order for the soul-making to be a justifier for evil, it must be that you wouldn't get the soul-making good without the permission of evil. It's logically connected. And we have many obvious examples. You couldn't have a serious assaulter of somebody who has to console someone who's been seriously assaulted. That's a good. To be able to console, unless God permitted the serious assault. So there's a logical connection between having the good of being able to console someone who's been seriously assaulted and God's permission of a serious assault. So now, those things are logically connected. And the issue there is, would the beneficiary of that good, of the soul making, would they, what would be their moral assessment of whether they should get that good? Now you're getting kind of to the heart of my argument here, the crucial part of the argument. And what I want to claim here is that if we know that we can be friends with God, or God, we could have the opportunity to be friends with God without God permitting horrendous evil, and maybe also we could know that we could have a decent life without God permitting horrendous evil, then whatever other goods God that aren't logically connected to the permission of horrendous evil, we could do without them, and maybe should do without them, because we could be friends with God, we could have a decent life. What other goods do we have to have, or should we want to have, at the price of horrendous evil? We should probably morally, since if we're in a position to prevent horrendous evil ourselves, we should do it. Well, certainly we should not accept or not want to accept any good that's conditional on the permission of that horrendous evil. So what I'm thinking is the beneficiaries of these goods, of the soul-making you're talking about, will wish that God had prevented the horrendous evil and they not have the good of soul-making there, because they don't need it. There's other ways. Look, there's soul-making which isn't logically connected to permission of horrendous evil. It could be lesser evils, serious evils, significant evils, but not horrendous. There could be lots of more trivial things, and you can get soul-making there. In fact, again, getting to my argument, what I'm imagining is that an ideally just, powerful state would have, if it could, prevent its citizens from committing horrendous evils on each other. The domain of soul-making would be restricted, but everybody would want it to be so restricted. It would be a better world. In fact, the whole idea of having a state is that we are trying to restrict evildoers. It's the whole business of it. So the idea that God can't be, he's got to give us freedom, and he can't be in the position of restricting evildoers. Well, why is that? He's actually in a great position, because when the state fails, he could succeed. And he could be, and that's the way he should be a preventer of last resort. And we would live a better life. All of us.
So a few things come to mind. First of all, the point about the word, or the wishing away, or the word would be better like that, as you're saying, for example, if it would be restricted to be what we have the decent freedoms. The fact, one of the reasons that I love your line of argument is there is actually an underlying axiological commitment, which to me at least seems to be really important, as you say. The fact that you would wish away those horrible things if you could, and you would want to restrict them happening and have a better world. And that's the part that in the relatively new literature that is happening in the axiology of theism with Kirk Logate and Liz Jackson and others are doing. That's the point that I think is what should really appreciate. But having said this, there is one typical worry, which is the dominant view, I think, among the theists, and that's the skeptical theism approach. So the skeptical theist would say, typically, why think that the evils that you know of are representatives of the objective, all the evils that exist, and also the goods? So it seems that the relations that you want between them to move other steps in your argument, as for example blocking the argument of William Rowe, seems to be mistaken. You can't move to that direction. So for example, one thing that I want to run by you is, how would you know, or why should we think that it's probable that God doesn't have unknown reasons for permitting these horrendous evils?
That's good. Maybe this is the point where I might maybe show a PowerPoint here to give you an idea. What basically the general answer is, what I have a way of talking about all the goods that God could provide us with, and breaking them down into 4 categories, and then I'll have a way, and then I will proceed to talk about each category. And this, in a way, is the answer to the skeptical theist. The skeptical theist is usually saying, well, there's some good you don't know about that could justify these evils. And I'm going to say, well, look, here's all the goods that God could provide us with. They're all fall into these categories. And I'll talk about each category, and I'll show you why God cannot permit horrendous evil to achieve a good of that category. So that's the general move here. But maybe it'd be good to see what the categories are here. Okay. All right. Now, so I mentioned that there's a 4-4 classification of all the goods that God could provide us with. And the way to see this is if you look at just 1 and 2, and just what they have there's a certain commonality to 1 and 2. They're goods to which we have a right. They both are goods to which we have a right. So 1 and 2 are good, but now there's different. 1 is goods to which we have a right that are not logically dependent on God's permission of especially horrendous evil consequences. And then the other one is goods to which we have a right that are logically dependent on God's permission of especially horrendous evil consequences. And then we go down to 3 and 4, and these have a commonality too. There are goods to which we do not have a right. They're both goods to which we do not have a right. The first one is goods to which we do not have a right that are not logically dependent on God's permission of especially horrendous evil consequences. And then the other one are goods to which we do not have a right that are logically dependent on especially evil consequences, on God's permission of especially evil consequences of immoral action. So the strategy against the skeptical theist here is to have this classification of goods and then be able to talk about what the morality of permitting horrendous evil is with respect to each of those classifications of good. So basically what happens next is when I told you Mackey's moral and metaphysical necessary premises were just not acceptable. They were not moral and necessary premises. I offer 3 what I call are their partial components of the Pauline principle, never to do evil, they come from it. And these 3 principles apply to the first principle applies to it applies to one of these kind of goods, the first kind. The second principle applies to the second and fourth, and the third principle applies to the third, or something. I forgot exactly which way they go. But anyway, the principles cover the goods in this fourth classification of goods, and they show that with respect to that kind of good, God could not be justified in permitting horrendous evil. So that's just, I have to actually put the principles out there next and then talk a little bit about how the principles apply. But that's the general nature of the argument. This part of it, that there are 4 different kinds of goods and all goods have to be one of those 4 kinds, is the beginning of the response to the skeptical theist.
It seems to me that what we have is, what we are doing, the skeptical theist could say, we are looking at humans, we're modeling the goods that humans know of, and then we're saying these are the possible goods. Why should we be confident that these 4-fold classification of goods could be reflected from us to God?
Well, here's this is partly some of the things you put into the page-to-page thing you sent me. So there's 2 issues here. The goods that are going to justify evils in the world have to be goods for some creature. I mean, they don't have to be just for. I mean, this argument holds for any created being that has, and it has to be. Can be harmed or benefited. So, if we were talking about Martians here, as including them in this whole thing would work just as well. So it does cover all created beings, and that has to be the good. That's. I mean, we are the ones that are suffering the horrendous evil, the creatures. So, and there has to be some good for us that's justifying that. And so I'm in the right scope there, but I thought there was something else creeping in here, and it does creep in. I've noticed it what happens is something like this. The way the skeptical theist initially was making his argument against the atheist was something like this. It was saying, look, we share the same moral principles. We understand moral requirements. But, they're just goods that you don't know about. That when you apply these principles to those goods, you get God's okay. You just didn't realize because of those goods. Now, when I say, but look, I can talk about all the goods, and there are no mysterious goods anymore. They're one of these four categories. And then, there's a little shift that can happen here. Oh, you know what? Maybe God's got different moral principles than we have. I mean, now this is not going to quite work here, because if we go this route, then what are we calling God morally good for? I mean, if he's got a whole different set of morality and different principles than us, how can we think that God is good? It's really not morally good. So I don't think that the theist wants to go there.
Let's put a cap on that, at least for now, because we have to specifically come back to that specific viewpoint. But one thing you said is really important. You said, for example, when you were criticizing Bergman's view on skeptical theism, you said that, okay, the fact that they are the party, the victims, or the human beings in this case, that are the victims of those horrendous evils, have to know of the fact that why it is that they have, in a moral way, why are they being affected? You write that this is just the kind of justification that Marilyn Adam thinks must obtain if God's permission of such evils is to be morally defensible. Yet even when consequences alone are being considered, as in Bergman's argument, there is still the need to justify to the victims what would have to be God's permission of the infliction of them of at least the significant and especially the horrendous evil consequences of the actions of wrongdoers. And then you continue, I should add, nor would it do to claim that God could have moral reasons for permitting significant and especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions to be inflicted on us that would be forever inaccessible to us. This is because reasons that would be forever inaccessible to us would not be moral reasons for permitting such consequences. Morality, as we noted earlier, only justifies impositions that are reasonably acceptable to all those who are affected. Now, so far so good.
Yeah.
But Bergman could come along and say, but the fact that we cannot see morally defensible reason for evil by the evil that has affected us doesn't mean that there isn't any. So, and the same goes for the victims. The victim cannot see a reason.
But those goods have to be of these four different categories. And I can talk about each of the categories and show nothing is escaping us there in that category. So it isn't, the way it worked before, why we thought maybe the skeptical theism might be right, was there was the category off the table that we humans didn't know about. But if we only knew about it, we would say, given our principles, yes, that would justify things. But now when we say no, they have to be these four categories, because this is a logically exclusive set of things here, and we can look and penetrate each one of them and see why no, God can't have any other reason for any justification for permitting horrendous evil to get this good. Why? Well, one of the cases, in the case of because he could easily get it without. Why would God permit horrendous evil to get a good, and maybe a good even that we don't have a right to, when he could easily get us that good without permitting horrendous evil? Just think of that the morality of that. Here's a good that, well, either we'll say we don't have a right to, or we could say we do have a right to, that God could provide us with without permitting horrendous evil. easily, well, then he should do it. We should do it. If we were faced with that, of course, why would you permit horrendous evil? Why would you take the bad means to get a good when you can have a good means to get the good? I mean, what's the, that's so obviously a moral requirement.
Right. So one thing this brings out is in your kind of frustration with this is the thing that you mentioned. You said the goods to which we have a right, and that plays in your fourfold classification of all the goods. The thing and how you bring it out in the book is that you have an analogy between the political and just state and the morality of the God. Now, there is some worry here, and I suspect, at least in my own mind. Now, this should be clear to listeners. I'm kind of biased here because I think the general approach of Jim is successful, I think. So, but I try to play the devil's court advocate as much as I can. So, and here's one worry that I have, is the analogy. So, and I think it's best captured by two people. First is Laura Ekstrom's, and then Michael Almeida's view on your view. So Ekstrom says it's difficult to interpret his moral evil prevention requirements, James, moral evil prevention requirements, she means, if one finds it difficult to interpret Sterba's proposed moral requirements, then it will be difficult to assess the claim that if God were to exist, God would be obeying the proposed moral evil prevention requirements, and also difficult to assess the claim that our observations of the world are such that we see clearly that the prevention requirements are not being obeyed or adhered to. Do you share this worry at all?
Well, just look at if it was difficult to assess these moral prevention requirements, we just assessed one a minute ago. It was the idea: shouldn't you be prohibited from permitting horrendous evil to achieve some good that you could easily achieve without permitting horrendous evil? That's one of the moral evil prevention requirements. It seems so obviously true. How could you say, no, I don't understand that one? I mean, the whole idea is, why would you be justified in using an evil means to get to a good when you could easily use a perfectly good means to get to the good? If that isn't a moral requirement, I don't know what is. Now, I have two more. So, I mean, maybe this one is easy. The others are not as easy. But the idea is they have that status. When we look at them, we don't say, oh, well, there could be exceptions to this. I mean, in fact, most of the people I really think about Hasker on this, who looks at my moral evil, they don't think there's necessarily exceptions to them. They have other ways of trying to come at this. And that I captured, three requirements here that you can't do what Plantinga did to Mackey's requirements, drive a truck over them easily, shows I've got something here. But of course, Mackey was a kind of meta-ethics guy, but he wasn't a normative ethics guy, and he certainly wasn't a political philosopher. And so he didn't think about what kind of resources are out there in moral political philosophy to propose as necessary moral requirements. And I've been just lucky to be on the scene when these issues were kind of going around, and I said, well, I think there are these, and then I've been formulating these three here. I think they have the status of obviously necessary moral requirements on us, and therefore necessary moral requirements on God. And the truth of the matter then is that God must be violating them all over the board.
And also, I should say that my main worry with the skeptical theism is when they close the door on goods in principle, things which are moral, right or wrong in principle, that doesn't work with me, because it just leaves the door too much open for moral skepticism. And if you don't want to allow moral skepticism in, then there seems to be at least if good obvious reasons, as you pointed out, or right moral actions, that the violation is just obvious, will just be clearly, automatically, not only intuitive, but clear cut for the case that the atheist needs. So
yeah, I think that's right. I think this is why the charge of moral skepticism keeps being raised against the skeptical theists, because they we see these things that look like immoral, and then the skeptical theist says, well, but there could be some good out there that could justify it. And we look at this and my gosh, I don't know anything about morality if there was some good out there that could justify it. And so our whole grip on morality starts to loosen. It's sort of what happens is, when I see it, this kind of challenge of moral skepticism to the skeptical theist is kind of another side to my argument. It's because there are these moral requirements that prohibit this kind of behavior that to say they're not, it just throws morality out the door and leads to skepticism. So I've been noticing how all these theists who just keep raising this question of, well, this leads to moral skepticism, are just in another way raising voice to my argument that there's a moral objection to what's going on. If there's a God, I mean, there's no moral objection to it in one sense, at least. I mean, what we're talking here about whether there's a God who's responsible for the evils of the world. If there's no God, then there's that responsibility for evil is out the door. There's other people are responsible, but no longer a God.
That's true. I don't know how I can put more pressure on this, but maybe let's second time's the charm. So another two sets of worries that Michael Almeida raises is again focused on the analogy between the just state and the moral requirements you have. And he says there seems to be two worries. First, we seem to have and I'm quoting here, we seem to have a conflation of political freedoms with metaphysical freedoms. The free will defense is concerned with the latter, not the former. There are no logical relations between these two sorts of freedoms. To be significantly free is to have a sort of metaphysically freedom, libertarian freedom of choice. In moral situations, we can have significant freedom and possess no political freedom at all. Further, we can possess every political freedom and totally lack metaphysical freedom. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, that's okay. That is his objection that he raises in his book review. So the issue here is, I would have wished that he would have looked at in the text where I give Plantinga's definition of significant freedom, and I then put my definition in contrast to it, and they're so similar. Plantinga's is a little bit broader than mine. Mine is a little bit. I mean, Plantinga thinks that their significant freedom is being an issue if somebody stepped in front of you at a movie theater for purchasing a ticket. I don't think that's I mean, freedom's an issue, but not a significant. So there's almost equivalence there on notions of freedom. But now here's another way of getting at this. So supposedly the metaphysical freedom is this indeterminate freedom, and Mike wants to say, well, that's not connected to political freedom. Well, think about it this way. Suppose you're confined in a small box, just a cage. Now, how much metaphysical freedom do you have there? Do you have the same amount of metaphysical freedom that you would have when you're outside the box, outside the cage, or have you now lost? See, notice your political freedoms are really lost in that cage. Is it that no, you have all the metaphysical freedoms you could ever have, or you still have them? I'm not sure that Plantinga certainly wouldn't want to say that, because what happens there is, in the box, you can do certain things, but you can't walk outside the box. And so that walking outside the box, that action, if it was done freely, would be indeterminate. But it would also have certain consequences to it. It's extended action. And when you put the cage in there, you take away part of what you could be metaphysically free to do. Your brain, your scope of metaphysical freedom gets really cut down. Or maybe just say your scope of freedom. Political freedom is kind of the extension of metaphysical freedom. You can't be metaphysically free to walk outside the cage unless there's political freedom to walk outside the cage. So it's a continuum there, and Mike doesn't seem to see that. I don't know exactly why, but because here's another way to think of it. If the metaphysical freedom is all just inside us, and it's nothing about what's happening out there in the world to us, then the evil in the world does not interfere at all with our metaphysical freedom, not a bit, unless it somehow destroys our minds. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could get it in there where we no longer could think, but as long as we can think and we're confined in this little cage, on metaphysical freedom, we got all the metaphysical freedom we'll ever have because it's all inside us, and it doesn't matter about what happens in the world. But no one thinks about freedom that way, I think Descartes at one point was entertaining freedom in this way, this kind of totally internal thing. But there's no problem of evil on that sense. But it's a kind of crazy sense to just talk about our totally internal acts and not anything about their external consequences and working them out. So political freedom and internal freedom, if it's external freedom, they kind of work together. And the problem of evil is about how those mixed internal, external things are to be evaluated.
He has another point. He says, secondly, Sterba's moral assumptions raise some concerns for his project. Why conceive of freedoms as morally protected rights to certain goods and opportunities? Why believe that we have a right to a certain level of welfare? Why take the doctrine of double effect or the Pauline principle seriously? There are numerous competing theories of justice on which these principles are simply rejected. I mean, this isn't, I'm interjecting here, but this seems, to my mind at least, hugely ambitious what Mike has in mind. But let's continue with what he says. He says, this is the main reason why discussion of the problem of evil has largely avoided moral commitments other than to uncontroversial moral theses such as pointless suffering is bad, consequences to do which matter, and we do have some duties of beneficence, and we do have duties of justice. What do you think of his?
That's an interesting objection, but let's just go back to the first part of that. He says, why conceive of freedoms as morally protected rights to certain goods and opportunities? Now, let me just add something to why conceive of morally justified freedoms as morally protected rights to certain goods and opportunities? Well, that would be, if I put morally justified freedoms in front of that, that makes it the obvious tautology. That is what, so of course we're going to think of morally justified freedoms as morally protected rights to certain goods and opportunities. Okay. Now, then the question is, well, do we have to believe that there's a right to welfare? Do we have to believe in double effect? Actually, it's kind of interesting. I do talk about double effect at the beginning and the Pauline principle as kind of being a component of the principle of double effect. But at the very end of the book, I say the issue of double effect is not involved here with the problem of evil at all. And I give reason that basically the argument there is that since God is supposedly permitting everything that happens in the world, he can't be just, in our terms, merely foreseeing something. To get the double effect principle going, we have to be in situations where we intend something and we merely foresee but not intend something else. But God can't ever be quite in that situation because everything that happens, certainly all the evils that happen in the world, God has to be permitting them. And God can't be if he's permitting something, he has to be doing it intentionally. There's no unintentionally permitting. It just doesn't exist. So the ripple effect is not there. But what about things like the right to welfare? I mean, I do talk about that a bit. But basically, I think what Mike did here is he kind of confuses illustrations and examples with what is presupposed by my argument. So the moral requirements that are presupposed by my argument are just those three moral evil prevention requirements. And we're really focusing on that third one, and we saw how trivial it was. I can make a case that the others are equally obviously minimal requirements that all moral people and God would have to abide by. They're not a right to welfare. It's not built in. None of those are requirements that say, well, there must be a right to welfare. You must establish a right to welfare. So that's the problem. So if you're really trying to zero in on my argument about the moral requirements and are they too grandiose or something, you have to zero in on those three moral evil prevention requirements, which are not the total Pauline principle, because the Pauline principle has exceptions to it. But these moral requirements, these minimal requirements, I claim are exceptionless, and they don't have exception. And I think illustrated it very well with respect to that third one. It would just be crazy to think this is not the moral requirements binding on all of this. Why should we use evil means, horrendously evil means, to get to a good that we could get to with morally acceptable means? That just has to be morally required on everybody. So he misses the target of where he has to zero in and try to show that those three moral evil prevention requirements are somehow, we could raise doubts about them. That's where he has to target his criticism.
Do you want to add anything for the second part of what he says or not?
Well, that's basically. So what I've done is we've talked about the two kinds of freedom, and I've tried to say that they're connected. With respect to the next thing he's basically saying is that I'm presupposing too much morality. And my claim is, no, this is really minimal morality here that I'm presupposing. Probably the villains of the world, many of them never violate these moral evil prevention requirements. They're really hard to. They're so easy to abide by in a way that we do it all easily, and God just flubs all over the place because he's got all this power. See, these principles don't apply to us in certain ways because we're not quite in the same situation God is. Sometimes they apply to us, but we have to be. We could easily, get some other way. That won't always be true for us. And so, yeah, that's why that's why the principles when they apply to God really have to hold. And they're not. He's violating them, and we're not violating them because they rarely apply to us.
Right, and I wanted to say the reason I say right is because I just had another quote by Ekstrom and her evidential worry, as it were, to share, and then you said this, and I kind of see now how your answer to this would go. So Ekstrom says, how do we assess the moral objectionability and moral non-objectionability of various ways of providing goods? Can we tell when there are countless morally unobjectionable ways of providing certain goods? And I think now, after I say this, I will let Jim come in and respond. But I think, to my mind, Jim would say, your way of thinking about this seems to presuppose that there are exceptions that we don't know of, but the moral requirements that I have offered are so minimal that the exceptions do not apply to that part of it. So let me just repeat what Ekstrom says and get your response to it. Ekstrom says, how do we assess the moral objectionability and moral non-objectionability of various ways of providing goods. For example, how do we do that when we're trying to entertain the other goods that can be provided for us which are non-objectionable? And can we tell when there are countless morally unobjectionable ways of providing certain goods?
Well, let's see. I think the idea here is the goods have to be in that fourfold classification. Okay, so that has to be the case. Now, and if horrendous evil is going to be justified, it has to be that the correct moral principles applied to those four classifications will allow a God to permit horrendous evil. Now, we know that horrendous evil is all over the world. I mean, there's no, that's the problem of evil has really basically one empirical premise. Now you could put it, there's evil, but there is horrendous evil consequences. And that's what I'm focusing on. Notice just a little aside here. I'm not really assessing the inner acts. A lot of inner acts are tremendously evil too. But I'm not condemning God for not interfering with those inner acts. Because one of the arguments there is, well, maybe that's where you should let freedom reign. I'm really, and this is kind of just state thinking. I'm looking at the external consequences. That's when the evil comes down on the victim, and that's where I want intervention. Only, and just if there's and we know there's not intervention there on a wide range of horrendous evils. Okay, now the question is, I think that the systematic application of those three principles to the four kinds of goods shows that there is no justification for God's permission of those horrendous evils. Where's the slippage there? I mean, the four classification seems to be tight. It's no way, well, there's some goods missing. There's a fifth classification you missed. No, I think this is fourfold. Here are these three principles. Could we say they're not binding, morally binding? Well, we really focused on one. We could talk about the other two. We could. But I think the upshot will be, well, they seem to be morally binding too. And then the upshot of those principles applied to the four kinds of goods, is that horrendous evils would be prevented, and they're not being prevented. So I don't know where the big contestable assumptions are there. They have to be either my fourfold classification is contestable, these three principles, requirements are contestable, or what? Or I think the application of the principles to the goods is pretty transparent. I just don't know where you're slipping something in here, or there's something you haven't thought of is going to merge. Now, maybe, look, I'll tell you, let me just go back to the argument that happened at Princeton. So here's the interesting good that came up that I hadn't been thinking about. If you bring the incarnation and redemption into the problem of evil, say, okay, give the theist as a creation, incarnation, and redemption. Then, and this is Marilyn Adams, this is the big move that Marilyn Adams makes. She says, well, then there is a good that God could be providing us with in the afterlife that would justify his permission of horrendous evil in this life. What is that good? Well, in the afterlife, we will have a camaraderie with Jesus, who also suffered horrendous evil. So you have this shared identity with the suffering Christ. You have it only if you suffer in this life. Wow. That's different from being friendship with God. That's also different from having a decent life. but it's logically connected to having suffered horrendous evil in this life. That was the objection that really stymied me for 2 days. And then I came up with this answer. I said, look, that is a good, but there's another good that would be better. And it's a good that if God had done what he should do, see, here's the crucial thing. Jesus' death on the cross was not needed for redemption. Any good act that Jesus did as God would have been sufficient to, and there's a whole issue about what redemption was about. It was kind of all about redemption for offenses against God, but no redemptions for offenses against human victims. I mean, nothing is going to be done in the afterlife for people who have been seriously assaulted, raped. Those memories will still be with them. And if you're going to wipe them out, then what's the point of allowing the actions in the first place? So the point is, let's just go back. Redemption, you could have had redemption if Jesus just did some good deeds. Now, so God should have really, applying my principles, should have prevented Jesus from being crucified. What would have happened then? Well, maybe Jesus would have turned out to be like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi, and they would be these justice fighters in the world, and we could have been fighters with them in the world and share camaraderie with them. That would have been a much better way of having camaraderie with the Christ, the God-man, than having camaraderie in the afterlife where we both suffered horrendous evils. No, it would be better to be a justice fighter in this life. God could prevent the evil, the horrendous evil, and we could be fighting about the significant evils in this life and overcoming them. And Jesus and us could have been a good example of that, and we could have been sharing his life in the world, as a lot of people are fighting for against injustices right now, and that would have been fine. That would have been the better way of doing it, and God should have chosen that better way. He should have consistently prevented horrendous evil, like I'm claiming he should be doing for us. He should have done it with respect to Jesus as well, and this whole different scenario of sharing with Jesus would have emerged, and it would have been better. Okay, all right. Yeah, can you see that now? Okay. Here, I've been talking about these principles. Here they are. So the first one, prevent rather than permit especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral action without violating anyone's rights, a good to which we have a right, when that could be easily done. I mean, we could talk about how easy that principle is to not violate. Usually we could be stuck in situations where maybe we could save someone's life or save 5 other people's lives, and we can't do both. Causally, we can't. But God would never be in that situation. He could always save both sets of lives. So it's hard to see why we could be stuck here where we can't easily do both, but God could. So the second one, do not permit rather than prevent especially horrendous evil, immoral action on which there would be victims, simply to provide rational beings with goods they would morally prefer not to have. Now, the argument there is why they would prefer morally not to have them is because they could have friendship with God without them. They could have a decent life without them. And they come at the cost of horrendous evil suffering on others. And so they would not only prefer not to have, they would also be required to prefer not to have them. I mean, so again, it seems like it's a no-brainer moral requirement. And the last one, which I've been saying all along was just obviously correct, is do not permit rather than prevent especially horrendous evil consequence of immoral action, which would violate someone's rights in order to provide goods to which we do not have a right that are not logically dependent on God's permission of those consequences when, here's crucial, when there are countless morally unobjectionable ways of providing those goods. So these are really minimal requirements, and because they're minimal, they're exceptionless, but you apply those to those goods, and it turns out the horrendous evils should be prevented, and they're not. We look around us, the horrendous evils are not prevented, so God is not doing what he could do if he existed. Okay, so that's that. Well, we could go away with that. Oh, just one more thing, just for illustrating of the whole argument, just to throw back to Mackey on here. Whoops. Okay, now this is just goes back to the comparison to Mackey. So this is in Mackey's argument starts off with there is an all good, all powerful God. Now, and then the other element of Mackey's argument, go to 4 here. Horrendous evil consequences of immoral action do obtain all around us, which if God exists would have to be through his permission. That's Mackey says there's a God, all good, and there's evil. And now the rest is why. So 2 says if there's an all good, all powerful God, then necessarily he would be adhering to moral evil prevention requirements 1 through 3. Those are those moral prevention requirements. If God were adhering to moral evil prevention requirements 1 through 3, then necessarily horrendous evil consequence of immoral action would not be obtaining through what we would have to be his permission. We wouldn't be seeing all these horrendous evil consequences. And 4, if they're they're horrendous evil consequences. Therefore, it's not the case that there's an all good, all powerful God. So this is what Mackey needed to do. Something, but he didn't know how to do it because he didn't spend much of his life as a moral political philosopher, and he was more of a metaphysician, and he just couldn't see his way. And people after him were not in moral political philosophy, so they thought, well, it's just impossible. Not impossible. They weren't going to make that. They didn't know how to do it. So the best thing was to use the evidential argument and talk about probabilities. And so that's what we've been doing for the last 50 years.
And so when Ekstrom says, can we tell when there are countless morally unobjectionable ways of providing certain goods, I think the burden is on those who are disagreeing in this sense only, in the sense that they should offer some sort of scenario that does not, that kind of makes trouble for the third moral requirement that you have. That's what they should do. And in absence of that, I'm hard-pressed to think of exceptions.
Well, here's the issue. You can almost show that they can't do it. Why? Well, the claim is that the good is not logically connected to the permission of the horrendous evil. And if it's not logically connected, then for God, he can provide the good without the evil. It's just that's what God could do all that's logically possible. And if it's not, in order for it to be not logically possible for God to do it, evil would have to be logically connected. But by hypothesis, we're dealing with an evil here which is not logically connected. The second principle deals with evils that are logically connected. And there I'm saying, well, given the context, we would wish them away. So I deal with them differently when they're clearly a logical connection and when there isn't. When there's no logical connection, there's no limitation on God because he's not bound by anything except logic here and morality.
So maybe logically, because God is bound logically. So I know you have this distinction between ethics after creation and before creation. So let me just play a bit into that. So take into account God's providence and the sustaining of the world at every moment. So in that sense, before creation and after creation, obviously God is equally perfect. So if he wants to sustain the world, so let me just say, since God is sustaining the world at every moment of the time, all moments of the time should include significant freedom of creatures, not just a period that includes, among other things, the agent's planning, to quote your book, to freely imagine, intend, and even take initial steps towards carrying out some evil, end quote. In other words, God's interfering with human freedom in the last moment of the time, when the agent is about to inflict the suffering on the victim, cannot be reduced, because that would be to reduce the amount of freedom because the freedom is preserved by God in all moments of time. So another way to say this could be, what gives the fulfillment of the duties of justice their great significance is the fact that moral agents are able to go very, very wrong at every moment of the time, but freely choose not to do so at every moment of the time. This is indeed what the vast majority of moral agents are doing most of the time. Therefore, all stages of the agent's action should be equally free, and removing the final step of the agent carrying out the evil act will be a reduction in the freedom in one moment of the time, which is contrary to God's sustaining freedom of all creatures in every moment of the time. In other words, the goods to which we have a right are the goods that are in every moment of time, from the agent's planning to freely imagine, intend, and even take initial steps towards carrying out some evil, and also including the stage they inflict that evil. So I basically took some ideas from Ed Feser's view of time and mashed it up with Mike Almeida's view. So what do you think of that? Maybe the reason...
There's a lot there. There's a lot there. Let me see if I can unravel a little bit. Obviously on this theory, God is sustaining the world and sustaining actions at all points. Now the question is, but whose actions should he be sustaining? So we could talk about think about a person that's going to do some horrendous evil, and God, on my view, will allow him to sort of make the plans for it, think about it, and now he's about ready to either pull the trigger or use the knife or whatever, and now we could sustain his freedom then. But of course, if we do that, if God does that, then there's the victim here whose freedom is being not sustained. It's being crushed. So the question is, in some sense, you might ask, well, whose freedom? God is going to be sustaining things no matter what he does. I mean, he always sustains, but who should he be sustaining? The perpetrator throughout everything? Or maybe the perpetrator up to a certain point and then the victim freedom after that. So that God will be sustaining is a story that can go where God doesn't interfere at all. And it could be a story that it can go where God interferes, but then sustains different freedoms from what happens in the world. Now, the other thing you mentioned there, it's an interesting move about what people, but it's sort of the argument, most people are good people. So they're not trying to kill and things. So if you kind of put a coercive regime on them, you've kind of might say taken away some of their virtue. This is the virtue they wouldn't have killed even if they if you don't prevent them. If you didn't have a preventive system, they wouldn't have killed. Now you've got a preventive system. They wouldn't have killed anyway, so why the preventive system sort of takes away some of their virtue, you might want to say. Because now, someone might say, well, you're not doing it because you're being prevented, or you'll get, Now, here's the way to think about why having the preventive system is actually a way of increasing virtue for everybody, even the good people. And here's how it works. This is actually how it works in good societies. What happens here is good people, think about a rich person. Just think about this rich person. And they could, there's hungry people, and they could distribute their wealth to people and maybe do a lot of good. But if that rich person is part of a society with other rich people and with structures, then together, now what happens? Now the rich person is now going to be taxed in this society quite a bit because we're trying to take care of poor people. So he's going to be constrained, but other rich people are good. And then also the ones that wouldn't help, the rich people, they're going to be taxed under the system too. The good person who would have done it anyway knows this. They're buying into a system where, and they're part, so they're going to be part of the system which is going to constrain them, but also constrain others and collectively do the good together. And you know what? They know if that's going to better help the poor. Then if everybody's doing this on their own, then some are not doing anything. So the idea is good people would want a society with constraints on the commission of horrendous evil, even though they would never do the horrendous evil. They buy into that system of constraints on themselves because it imposes constraints on people who would do the horrendous evil. It's got to be, the system has to be a universal system. And so they buy into the universal system, and they're part of that. They get credit for that. So they're constrained, and then they're empowered. Constraining and empowering. And that mix, the kind of the just state or just arrangements give us of constraint and empowerment is better than being the lone person on the street doing whatever we could do. I mean, you're not going to achieve a lot of good that way. And we know that. That's why we got societies that have these cooperative adventures. Now, why the philosopher of religion, it's got us look like in a state of nature with, coming up against the world individual by individual. Why we would ever think this is the way that we should be thinking about how God should do it when we don't do it that way, because it isn't good to do it that way. We've learned that in political philosophy. And so that's the problem. This is, again, the absence of political thinking here, political philosophy thinking on the part of the philosopher of religion that got them into this mindset, which doesn't see that there's another way to think about this, which provides a better solution both for us and for a deity.
It seems then, to me, it seems in my mind at least, that the goods that have to be distributed in every moment are just the type of goods that we deserve. And if those are the types of goods that have me in each moment, then yeah, we're free, we're off the hook. The logical argument goes through, you're right, yeah. So that just takes us to the value of free will and God's interventions now. Because you say that, okay, imagine you cannot help 40 people because you're causally limited. Because you are causally limited, but God is not bound by the same logical limitation that we are bound. So God can prevent in the last step, that is taking the steps to freely imagine, intend, and even take initial steps towards carrying out some evil, but God enters and prevents in the last stage, which is the inflicting of the evil on the victims. So what these interventions seem to be weird, as one might say it, because God's prevention could, as Swinburne and others have said, lead to some sort of a divine kindergarten that just we lose the exercise of free will, the significance of the freedom we have to kind of develop our characters. So what do you think of that?
Good. That's very good. That, in fact, it's such a good objection that I actually repeat my response, my answer to it in almost, well, I use slightly different examples, but it's the same reply about 3 times in the course of the book, because I know how important it is. And even after as I stated in the book, I had to deal with William Hasker on this, Bill Hasker, and he kept pressing it. And it was only in my reply to him in that first special issue that I put it in a way that he can't object to anymore. See, the problem, the way I had stated it, is that, I think that the prevention should be significant and a special horrendous evil. So it should include significant and horrendous. But then the problem there is someone might want to say that that if God would be preventing the significant as well as the horrendous, then we'll be in this moral kindergarten. Okay. Let me then back up a little bit and say, I only want God to prevent the horrendous. Imagine that he did only prevent the horrendous, not the significant. So now here's why we would still have moral motivation. If we knew that God would somehow step in and prevent the horrendous, but not the significant, then we would realize that if we didn't prevent the significant when we could, we would be responsible for that significant. So the idea is, well, and I think is, well, maybe we just step back, God will do it. Well, when I imagine God doing it, he could prevent significant and horrendous, but he doesn't do it. Imagine he just prevents the horrendous and lets the significant go through. And because when we could have prevented both, but we don't do anything because we're going to say, God will do it. I saw him do it before. He'll do it again. And then we say, well, if what God then does, like we say, here's the, in the first case, imagine what happens is we're trying to prevent some evil. And we realize we're not going to be able to do it. And then imagine God steps in and then we're unable to prevent the significant and horrendous evil, both consequences. Then we say, wow, I think that was God there. I think it was God. So now we come to another situation where we're faced with the same situation. We say, okay, maybe I'll step back. I mean, God will take care of this. And so he stepped back. And then what happens is it turns out that the significant evil, the horrendous evil is prevented, but the significant one isn't. And we say, oh my gosh, I could have prevented both, but I stepped back and said, God will do it. And I see, well, he does do something. He prevents the horrendous, but not the significant. So the significant is on my shoulders. And then I say, I can't have that. I'm trying to be, I was trying to be moral about this. God was doing too much, let him do it, But no, God is stepping back and allowing us, say, if you don't cooperate here, we don't do our best, then we won't, there'll be significant evil. And if we did cooperate, we could be in the position of preventing significant and horrendous. We could have that virtue on our plate. So that's and what I had to do with Hasker is once I said, all right, I'm not going to say God should be preventing significant horrendous, just horrendous. And then it's obvious that the significant is a moral problem for us, that we're allowing the significant evil. And that's not enough. That doesn't make it a moral kindergarten. It makes it a world where we're allowing all this significant evil and we could have prevented it. So he backs off at that point. He realizes I've got that answer. Now it's a little bit, I'm not too happy with that answer because I do think that, God should sometimes still prevent the significant too. I'm trying to think morally, we should do both. I mean, that God lets this happen, but I'm thinking maybe God is worrying about the moral kindergarten, would be worrying about the moral kindergarten objection. And so he's going to make sure we see the difference here. So we're going to let those significant evils in. If you don't act, you're gonna be responsible for them. And so maybe that does morally justify God's permission of significant evils. So, but it clearly destroys the moral kindergarten. It took me a while to get there. And if Hasker he raises it in his first thing on the book, the Author Meets Critic session. He raises it there. I try to respond to it there. He comes back to it again in the afterwards, and I try a little bit more there. He finally raised it again in the first issue, and I finally think, you know what, I could make this difference, and he'll have to agree to it, and I think the objection fell away. There was some other interesting point where Hasker and I were disagreeing, and I saw we were thinking about using consequences in different ways. And I explained it to him, and that disagreement went away. Now, I'm sure he's got some more disagreements that are going to come at some point, but it was really, the discussion with William Hasker is one of the most fruitful ones I've had with any theist. He's been there for me to talk about this stuff and back and forth. There was one time we had a disagreement about what Plantinga thought. And so about when he said something like that, his theory was they wanted to show that his theory was that God was compatible with some moral evil, and I just thought that that meant any moral evil. And then that would have been a problem, because if it's a horrendous evil consequences, then freedom is not going to justify that. It was a trivial, and Hasker said, no, he doesn't mean any evil consequence. I said, let me email Al about this. Now I was not in great health now, but I emailed him back, and Al agreed with this. But then the only response is, well, but no, you shouldn't go there. So you better understand it as not any evil, but some evil. So but then if you just do it some evil, the argument works. But then there's some evil it doesn't work for, and so you got the problem.
But then that's the regularity. So the regularity worry, which is the same. If God intervenes, then we won't be able to comprehend, and the regularities of the natural world won't be intelligible to us. Now, before getting to it, it seems to me that the example you gave in the book was really good, and the example you gave to kind of drive the intuition, the initial intuition, before giving your reasoning for it, was the superheroes. Like the superheroes that we know of in pick your favorite superhero, right? They intervene, but there are regularities. Still, it just happens that the regularities would be different, but there would be regularities.
Yeah, there's a sort of side story on this. When I was first thinking about this project and taking it to Templeton people, I really, from my youth, because I was really loved the superheroes. I said, I'd like to go through the superhero literature and see if there's some issue about the problem of evil here. And the people at Templeton come back and say, we don't do literature. So I dropped it. So I framed it in philosophy terms, but then I bring the superheroes back in. I was not going to let them go. So no, I do think that they're an interesting illustration of what it is. And then there's also, it came more recently, there's a moral principle that shows why natural regularities cannot be binding on a moral being with power to make exceptions to them, because it's something like this, that is if a morally good result, morally required result, preventing some horrendous evil requires making an exception to natural regularities, well, of course you should do that. Morality trumps nature. It is, for a being that can go against nature for very strong moral reasons, preventing horrendous evil, then of course that's what the being should do. Nature should never be the standard of what a morally good being should do. That can't be right. Morality is a norm above natural regularities.
So what about the fact that so let me just pause here and ask, do you want to cover what Hasker said, or should we just move on? Because I think you sufficiently talked about this one.
Yeah, I think it does when he attacks the state and
so this is what Hasker says. Hasker says, and I'm quoting him here, Sterba appeals to the idea of an ideally just and powerful state as an analogy to help us see what we should morally expect of a good God. In fact, I view the notion as completely unusable. It plays no role at all in my thinking about these topics. It is obvious that no such a state exists, nor should I say, is there anything like an approximation to it. Given what we know of human nature, I do not think anything of this sort is possible. I should strongly oppose giving to any human government powers sufficient to make it a plausible analog of the divine governance of the world. The principle does not require the exercise of free will shall itself be controlled. Only the harmful consequences of such exercise will be prevented. But once it becomes generally known that such consequences will not be allowed to occur, it will become in effect impossible for anyone to act in the ways that would have such results. Furthermore, the motivation of humans to care for one another by preventing serious harms to others will be considerably lessened once it is recognized that such harms will not be allowed to occur in any case. So what do you think of this?
Yeah. Okay, of course, it ends up with the kindergarten objection. So I haven't dealt with the kindergarten objection. Now, the idea that, well, there are no such states. Well, that's right. There's no ideally just and powerful state. But the idea is we could still think of, think about a state that's something like that. I mean, to say it ideally, it depends what you mean ideally here. I mean, it can't be that the state has all the powers God has, or understands morality or justice is just as God understands it. So it's not a kind of, but the idea here is it's there's an approximation. Let me come at it a slightly different way. There's a movie in the United States, the Minority Report. If you know the Minority Report. It's a very interesting movie. When I started doing this, people started to give me examples that I hadn't known about. But the Minority Report is an interesting case because there's a case where they're basically doing kind of the thing I wanted. You stop people at the last moment before they commit Now, it wasn't clear that they were going to commit it or not. So I am, in my case, the bullet's going out the gun. That's when you get it, or the knife is coming down on the chest. That's when you get. So you could handle that part. But the other part about it is that what happens in the Minority Report case is there's corruption in the system, and the whole thing is being used for bad purposes, and so they wipe the whole thing out at the end. But see, if God were running this thing, wouldn't be corruption at the highest levels. He wouldn't be doing it for bad reasons. I mean, he would be trying to get the bad people and not, make a career for himself or something. I mean, it was all that. That's why in real world, we don't want absolutely powerful regimes because they can be corrupt. And when they're corrupt, they can do a lot of corruption. So we're reluctant to give states the power to do the kind of thing that would prevent all the horrendous evils in the society, because that would also give them the power to do all the horrendous evils themselves, and they might well do that. So that kind of problem with visualizing it in human terms is the limitation of the analogy. But when you think about God just doing what we kind of would like a state to do if it could only do it, but can't manage to do it because it gets corrupted, then we could see, yes, he would prevent the external consequences of the horrendous acts, and that would be a good thing. So I don't see that. I think the idea that you don't find them around, right? That's true. But we have a reason why we don't want to instantiate the power of the kind of state I'm talking about. But in the God case, that problem would vanish. And so it's something like the just state should be working as a criticism of God's activity.
Yeah, and also it seems that the limitations on that scenario of the just state are limitations of resources or time or the lack of corruption, as you put it, and these things, obviously, God is free of them, and therefore the state to have these, so to be free of these things, they could, but the fact that God does not need them and can do them at the highest level seems to be something that is on your side, I think. But what about the fact that maybe these regularities are necessary? Maybe there is just one possible word, the creation, and the creation of our word is just the best option. So God must have wisely chosen this kind of natural word because it's the best kind of natural word, even though it has produced a less than best of all possible historical words. So a hypothetical word would clearly be more preferable to our word. It is the word that the God of traditional theism would have brought about. But such a word is only epistemically possible, not metaphysically. Since there is only one metaphysically possible world, which is this one, so God could either create and not create. But since you are, Jim, your argument is engaged with ethics after creation, then how do you go about?
Well, I mean, this is, it goes back to Leibniz here and whether it's the best possible world. And I think what's problematic here is is how to think about a God creating and what are the constraints on that. And the whole idea there is that one of the arguments against Leibniz is any world you've got, then you could always think of a world with some more creatures in it, and then maybe that's a better world if those creatures could be happy in addition to the happiness in the existing world. Well, you see, the problem with that is in order for God to have to respond to those possibilities, it has to be better. You have to ask better for whom. And if in the beginning, if there's just God, there's no others out there that God is making the world better for. So in some sense, at that point, there's no constraint, seems to be almost no constraint on what worlds God could create. What he can possibly do would be something, make a world where the creatures in it would be better off not existing. That would be too much. But outside of that, I think in that initial act, this is the ethics before creation, that since there's nobody there that God would be constrained by making it good for them, there's no constraint on what he does except this internal one, that the beings he brings into existence would not be better off not existing. So that gives God a whole range of possible worlds to create. There's no limitation on the possible worlds that he could create. What happens, though, is after he's created and he's in the business of sustaining, well, then the issue about, well, could he make things better for the beings that he created? Now there's somebody in the ethics after creation. You've got these beings. Now, you could either prevent evil with respect to happening to them, or you can provide them with resources to have a good life. You can do things for them, and you and them are now there. You're both there, and now the question is, what's the morality of now the two of you are on the scene? What should the powerful being be doing? Before, when no creatures were on the scene, God is a free hand. After creation, he doesn't have a free hand.
Let me push back here, because your line of thought is committed to something like this, that the creatures at least are better off existing than not existing, given their natural capabilities.
That has to be for any creature that God creates. It's got to be that they're better off existing than non-existing. Yeah, I think I want to go there. Yeah.
One line of thought is to go off topic and then come back, because that's relevant, is the asymmetry that David Benatar talks about, better not to have been. Now, it seems that if evil is necessary, and Benatar's idea is basically the asymmetry, basically. And he says, the absence of pain is good, even if the good is not enjoyed by anyone, whereas the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is someone for whom this absence is a deprivation. So it seems that if evil is necessary, there is necessarily a harm that people who exist will come to it if the theist says that the evil is necessary. And if the evil is necessary, then it seems to me that to exist is not to be better off here.
Well, wait a minute. I've never quite followed. Well, I was thinking about Benatar recently. I actually went and was thinking, because I'd been involved with him before on other issues. And so I was thinking maybe I could come back to this issue and we could have a discussion on this. but then I kind of realized he's having some very difficult times on other issues at home there, and I decided not to raise this. But I never quite understood what this argument that what he's presenting is. I mean, I don't think that, non-existent. No, you mentioned it, non-existent pleasure, non-existent. I mean, if things are, they don't have any value. Things that don't exist, they don't have any value. I just don't want to say. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to say about. You see, there's an ethics. The analogy of creation is the analogy of procreation for us. So now, but it's more complicated for us because we could procreate for not just. I mean, the beneficiaries of procreation could be other people that already exist or ourselves. So the idea that that we're procreating now, procreating for the good of the person that will come into existence. That this is the beneficial. This is a crucial question that is going to be relevant, and I don't necessarily have an full answer to it with my debate with Swinburne. That by bringing us into the world, God does something good for us. I'm not quite sure I want to go there. Whether God benefits us by the sheer act of creation. I mean, the idea would be something like, when do we call parents benefactors? Well, what if they just brought us into the world and left us on the operating table or whatever? And would we call them a benefactor? No. I mean, so I'm not sure that the act of procreating is an act of benefiting. And therefore, I'm not sure that the act of creating by just that is an act of benefiting. So that means, because if you say, well, who benefited? Well, it sounds like there was a person before the creation who now gets the benefit and becomes created. And no, there's not these possible people out there who are subject to benefit if you bring them into the world. No, I don't want to go there. But I haven't quite thought myself through all this, but I just don't, that's my best thoughts at the moment.
So the reason I'm saying this is because it seems that if we do not want to let go of the ethics before creation, as Michael Tooley and Laura Ekstrom also point out, is because we could say that the first order goods to which we have a right are sacrificed from the start in act of creation to secure the goods to which other things that we do not have a right, the necessary evils occurring. It has been created so far that they violate the goods to which we have a right from the start.
Yeah. Well, Tooley wants to allow that God can, if God created other worlds, he would have done something better than our world. I mean, but I just don't, I have to say, better for whom? I mean, if God creates other worlds, it isn't better for us. I mean, I'm just, I always have this problem. Whenever they say it would be better if God did this, I want to say, and for whom would it be better? And then I don't think I get a good answer to that for whom question. And then maybe I want to say, well, then there is, you can't say that bringing into existence other beings is somehow making it better for them. I mean, that's the problem. Oh, here's the worry I have. It goes right back to something I did very early on in my career, where I was trying to deal with the abortion question and whether what the obligations were there. And I did want to say there was a kind of argument from Joel Feinberg at the time, maybe also Jan Narveson, that wanted to say that if some person was brought into the world, infant, and they were going to have a horrendously painful life. This is the infant with maybe half the brain lost or whatever, something terrible, and that person would have a right not to be born. And I kind of wanted to say that made sense to me. But then I thought, if that makes sense, then maybe there should be a right to be born. Now, who has, I mean, if the person, so if the idea is that you're going to allow that this person has a right not to be born, now you don't want, and so you want to respect that right before they come into existence. You don't want them to be born. Well, then it looks like, by analogy, there should be this right to be born under certain prevailing conditions. Now, I'm not sure how to think about it. That really is something it is relevant to this issue. Exactly how it works, I'm not sure yet. I haven't quite figured that out. But it was a concession I wanted to make early on to kind of, for those who were against abortion, I wanted to say, well, there's a little something to the argument here. It's not in the usual cases because maybe the woman's right is more important in some other things, but there could be cases where there is this right to be brought into existence. And so, and those who are kind of defending the strong abortion rights, like Feinberg and Narvis at the time, really, well, and wanting this right to deal with very badly endowed infants, well, then they should grant this comparable right. So I haven't quite worked all that out, but I don't see any terrible problem there. I don't like this idea of comparing possible worlds and this world is better than that world when you have totally different people in it. I just don't know how do you do that comparison, because I guess it's better for whom? I don't know who the relevant whom is that should have purchased there.
All I wanted to say was maybe one could say that the goods to which we have a right have been sacrificed maybe in this actual world from the start. And that's why we see this specific word with its regularities and so on, like ethics before creation.
Well, could you give an example of what you mean there? What do you mean, but how they were sacrificed? And what do you have in mind?
So, for example, let's say that there are natural resources, and because these natural resources run out somewhere, maybe they, as climate change gets worse, for example, animals will come into contact and attack humans more. And if at the outset, at the start of the creation, the distribution of natural resources was in another way, in some way that the goods to which we have a right, like not being assaulted by maybe, someone else, was secured by this type of more equal distribution of natural resources, that wouldn't lead to war, for example, or things like that.
Well, yeah, I think that, if God were doing his job, we wouldn't have global warming, I'm sure. The idea that we're on this precipice and heading down into disaster is another sign that there's no deity behind the whole thing. Now, of course, theists could say, oh, well, don't worry about that because there'll be an afterlife, everything will be fine. But maybe that's an argument why you want this argument against theism, that you want people to be concerned about this world. Now, many theists are. But I think some also are taking somehow comfort in their belief in an afterlife, which will get them out of all the problems that they're complicit with in this life. And I don't think that's a good way of thinking.
Let me just jump in and say that we have run out of the 2-hour time. I have time, I can continue, but I know you're justifiably busy. If you want to go, you can.
No, let's go. Let's keep going. You got more things to talk about. Because I find this a very, very interesting discussion, and I'm really enjoying it, and it's helping me think through the argument as well as it's helping you to figure out what the argument is.
Right. This is fascinating to me. This really is fascinating. So yeah, let's just keep going. So one side or area that has yet to be engaged with more and more is the sort of people who have this view that, look, there are moral requirements or moral considerations for creatures, God is the creator, and so God does not, the same moral considerations just do not apply to God as the creator. As Ekstrom puts it, I love this. She says, some theorists, Mark Murphy, for one, deny the first premise of your argument. Murphy alleges that God may allow some facts about evil in our world, including facts about human suffering and death, to obtain for no reason at all, because God has no requiring reason to prevent them. So let's just recap really quickly. The skeptical theists like Michael Rea and Bergman, they denied the second premise because they said, we do not have the complete knowledge we have to understanding between the human beings and the God that we need. And people like Richard Swinburne then are completely different in that, or John Hick, who go to deny the third premise, and because they say they have reasons for which God is justified in allowing the facts about evil. The defenders, the so-called defenders, Peter Van Inwagen, for example, suggests that God justifying reasons are possible for all we know to be true. So what about those who do not think that God is a moral agent?
Oh, well, yeah, well, now I've dealt with one of the chapters is dealing with that Davies view, and that was somebody put me on to this is a possible move here, that some theists are going to say God is not a moral agent, and so what are you going to do there? And I actually Davies came down to he was actually talking at the St. Mary's College, which is nearby, and I engaged with him there, and I eventually was also invited up to Fordham to present my argument. It's interesting. Davies is kind of, he doesn't have anything much critical to say about my argument. So if you think that God is an all-good, all-powerful being, morally good, then my argument works. He's not going to check. So it's his argument that, well, God is good, but not morally good. Well, the problem that happens there, and there's another person, Brian Huffley, who actually develops Davies' view. I think Huffley's a very modest guy, but I think he does say things that Davies hadn't yet said, and helps to bring it out. And we've debated at his home institution. We're going to debate again in April before at some evangelical conference where there's going to be about 2,000 people attending, and this is going to be the main event. So I'm not sure. I'm committed to this. So I wanted to pursue this line because it's a possible way that theists can go. But I think what happens is these theists also want to they want a lot of what's in the Bible. So they want to be able to say God is just and merciful, he's wise, but they're going to say, but not morally good. And then they say, well, when we say God is just or merciful, wise, we're talking analogy. We're not talking. It's not an univocal language. Not using the term exactly the same way we say we're just. Okay, and that's a standard move. I've been educated in Thomism most of my up to graduate school. I know the Thomism. I like the analogical thing. I think actually there's so much analogy running through almost everything we talk about in daily life. It's the way to understand things. So okay, it's analogical. But if you say now justice is analogical, and mercy is, what about morally good? Why can't we understand that as being analogical? And if you're still having problems with it, what about talking about God is good with respect to his actions? Is that okay? Can we talk about God is good with respect to his actions? Well, that's just what morally good is about. So, I just don't know how, there's kind of an inconsistency here. Either you're going to use analogical language to talk about justice and wisdom and mercy, but not moral goodness. But why not? And then if you kind of pare down moral goodness as you could talk about God is good in terms of his being, and God is good in terms of his action. And you're not going to have, and what is God good is in terms of his action? Well, that's what we mean by morally good. So I just don't see how you're not going to get moral goodness here somehow. It just has to be, you're only going to not have moral goodness by being inconsistent.
Now, I have no idea about Davis, whether or not he holds to the divine command theory in his meta.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't want that. He really, a good Thomist that he is, he doesn't want the divine command theory there. No. I actually, in that chapter, I discussed the possibility of divine, because I like to just put it out there. But then I say Davies doesn't go there, and he doesn't. Yeah, and so it's just, if you go with divine command theory, I actually think, and this relates to something else you should come to, I actually don't think you have a problem of evil anymore. So if divine command theory is, in some sense, whatever God does or what commands, he can command something and then go against his command. Well, I guess you could be that. If it's a command for him, now this question, does commands only apply to us? Or does it, see, I think that here's the way to think about that the commands can't just apply to us. I think the commands, or command about don't harm, is a command that applies to all rational beings. That's God. God's a rational being. Now, maybe he's not a human being, but he's a rational being. And so I think that the morality applies to all rational beings. It applies to Martians who there's no way, but some place in some planet, which looks like there's unlikely there's going to be any planet that's going to be able to harbor life anymore, or ever has been able to harbor life. So, but if there were, then and they're rational, then don't harm, don't do unnecessary harm becomes a moral requirement.
Does that mean that your argument presupposes moral realism then? What would be the important differences here between your argument and Mackey? Because Mackey, as you said, was a moral subjectivist. So
yeah. Well, what Mackey had to do when he came to the problem of evil was to just basically he had to assume objectivism for the sake of argument. He couldn't. If you have this objectivism, there's no object. I mean, what's evil? What you think is evil? What somebody else's think is evil? I mean, but Mackey, his subjectivism was kind of unusual. He had this kind of what did he call it? Air theory of morality. He thought it was useful for us to think. Now, watch this. Useful was to think about morality as being true, even though it wasn't true, a fiction. He said it was useful. That's objectivist language. So the whole fiction, if the justification for thinking about morality as a fiction is that it's useful, it's an objective justification. So it really wasn't a subjectivism after all. I mean, kind of a strange way. I mean, so it's just unclear what it is. It's generally going to be unclear what a subjectivist is. I mean, what is the subjectivist? Everything you happen to desire, any particular desire, then that's what you ought to do. I mean, what is going to be the subjectivist route? Yeah.
Now, let me just say that I'm also sympathetic with moral realists here, but there is another avenue too. The atheist could launch this critique as an internal critique of theism. So the person could say, look, you are committed to this framework, and given that you are committed to this.
Yeah, he could do that. That's right, and I could do that. But see, again, from the moral and political philosopher that I come from here, is I've kind of worked through some of the main questions in moral and political philosophy. That's why my last book was entitled From Rationality to Equality. And what that basically did, and this is relevant to Murphy's discussion, you mentioned Murphy, is basically it's an argument against the egoist, and that there's a standard of rationality, which is non-question making, is giving good arguments that the egoist can't meet, but the moralist can meet. And so from that standard of rationality, morality is to be rationally preferred over egoism. Well, then but then, there's lots of ways of reading morality. So you run a political discussion, you get libertarianism, welfare liberalism, socialism. You do an ethics discussion, you get Aristotelianism, utilitarianism, and Kantianism. Now, my move there, just do the one in political philosophy, the one that seems to have the least strong requirements is the libertarian view. It's only liberty. You don't have any positive obligation. You just have don't interfere. I show that on the libertarian view, it will lead to the welfare liberal conclusions and ultimately socialist conclusions. So so basically, once I get my argument from rationality to morality, and then take seemingly the weakest morality, which is libertarianism, I can move all the way to the equality of the socialists. So now that's the backdrop. That's my argument for someone. I'm a subjectivist. I see you moral people are objectivists. I'll play this game with you and show you got a problem. But me, I'm a subjectivist. Well, fine. That is a problem if you endorse objectivism. But look, you're not in any good position here with your subjectivism. There's strong arguments for objectivism, and you're not crazy if you don't do that. I don't even know. You'll probably be inconsistent because nobody lives the subjectivism route. So I don't know how much we have to do to defeat the would-be subjectivists here. I think the real battle is to get the objectivists together about practical norms. But there's things can be done there. It would be really a problem if it turned out that the basic norms at the normative level were just, sometimes McIntyre used to use it, incommensurable. Well, then it's like, strawberry vanilla ice cream. I mean, good grief, this is terrible. But I think the arguments that they're incommensurable just don't try to internalize what their opponents are thinking. I think if you go into your opponent and really try to understand their view, you can find resources there for bringing them over to your view. That's been my experience.
I think so too. So that was just to get your opinion on moral realism, and also your view on whether or not the argument presupposes moral realism or not. So one thing that I wanted to say is, let's take a different model of God. Now, I know that your argument is not aimed at open theism, but let's nominate open theism here. So there could be different ways that you could go about being an open theist. One idea would be, it's just to have knowledge of the future is just not possible. So they're not limiting God, they're just limiting the possibility of what's logically possible. And they say, so God takes risks. So, and he's taking risk at the moment of the creation. So, and one of those risks include, because of the significance of the freedom to risk the evil, and because they do not want to, because God does not want to reduce the significance and the importance of freedom for creatures, so doesn't have any knowledge about future events, and hence no knowledge about how things might happen in future for anyone. The victim or the victim that comes to inflict the pain in that last stage, God's intervention then doesn't seem to be possible, because God would know something that in this model doesn't know. So what do you think about open theism?
Actually, I like open theism. I think that there's something, I mean, you have to, I think if you're going to be an indeterminist, and I'm not sure, I actually like determinism a lot, but it's a little hard to run a defense of theism under determinism. So that's why, I'm willing to, again, give the theist the indeterminism issue. But so I'm willing to allow, God creates an individual, brings them. I mean, I don't, in one sense, I don't like this creating. It looks like God is right there at procreation, bringing us into the world. But I mean, if the act of creation, God, starts the Big Bang. I mean, that's it. And then everything kind of moves from there through the dinosaurs, running all the way, and then us. And it doesn't look kind of like, well, he's now starting the Big Bang brought us out here. But let that go. Let that go. But the point is that although he can't foresee, given especially indeterminism, what's going to happen from a distance before the action, even maybe before he's created us, imagine, again, with the procreation. Once we're there and start to move through life, there's moments where just before we're going to do the horrendous evil, he's in a sustaining mode here. He's right on the scene. He could stop that evil. He doesn't have to. His action is, I mean, again, what you got the sustaining thing going, his action isn't limited to that first creative bang there, and then he can't do anything else. He doesn't know what's going to happen with the bang, No, he's following the whole thing along, living along with it, and then we come to the horrendous act, and we don't get that off. We think about it, but we don't put the knife down into the innocent person's chest. So I don't. And open theism is usually about this internal act, which is supposed to be uncaused. But after the internal act happens, it generates a series of causal events, which we and get outside the individual, and we follow that, and we can sometimes stop, and of course God could too. So it's kind of, again, thinking there's only the one thing God can do, something at the very beginning, and then he has to let everything go from there. No, that's not the model of the all-powerful God.
But there is something to being the necessity of God. I mean, the fact that God does not have ignorance in his nature is supposed to be because he's necessary, and his necessity, let's say, is grounded in his perfection, for example, or because of his perfection. So, and if he's necessary, then he has also different duties because of his necessity. Could have different duties than we do. So God is necessary, but political states are not. So maybe the fact that the moral considerations are different for us is because God is necessary, and for him the moral considerations are different in virtue of him being necessary, but political states are not necessary. So then moral considerations are not the same. So the analogy that you have between analogy of the just ideal state and the God, I think maybe the reason that we come out with different answers like a theist would be here. The theist would say God's necessity has something in it that makes his moral duties to his creatures different than for the political states, and that's because of the necessity of God, for example. Well,
I thought about this one. Yes, just the last point you had on this list. If there's a God of traditional theism, then a moral order would be enforced by that God. That would be the necessary thing there. That's part of the necessity of the God of traditional theism. And you couldn't have the God of traditional theism without the necessity of the moral order being enforced. So now it's true that will be true even if God doesn't create anything. It'll still be that he would be bound by the moral order. Whatever he does, if he did anything outside himself, I mean, then the moral order would have to be imposed. If he doesn't do anything, then so the idea, and if he creates different worlds, from ours, not ours, but some others, then of course there'll be different states. The state is a kind of a contingent organization of creatures in a world created by God, and the necessity of the state is not like the necessity of God, for sure. It's a very contingent thing, but it has to be governed by the same moral order that God is always governed by. So in our world, well, with states, there's a moral order, and it gives us rise to the idea of a just state. And we're thinking that moral order is the same moral order that God has to be operating with, because what grounds, if it isn't that moral order, it's some other moral order, God operates by some totally different moral order than we do, well, then he's not good by our standards. He's something else. Yeah. But I don't think we want to say that. We want to say, no, the moral order we see here is the moral order God has. And that's why look, there used to be a lot of wiggle room here that, for getting God off the hook. There were goods we didn't know about. All right, right. Nobody could think of the moral principle that God was violating, that necessarily there wouldn't be exceptions to it. Everything we see has exceptions, because we don't think about kind of my moral evil prevention requirements. Those are not in the general discussion. So the things we think about all have exceptions to it. So of course, then God would be, maybe the moral principles will be provide an exception to God. So the theist discussion here had lots of escape routes. And then this last one I didn't quite see, the incarnation redemption. You'll be like Jesus in the afterlife. You'll suffer. I mean, there are just so many things that can be done here. But they also can be faced. They can also be addressed. You just have to you have to know that tradition pretty well. And then you have to also have the tradition of morality pretty well intact. So you now think about, well, how do these things work together? And ultimately they find out, well, they don't work together. So it doesn't work. You can't get a justification.
Right. And if the moral order is somehow completely different for God, then it seems that even those concepts that we had by analogy, that kind of worked. For example, like the things in the Bible, for example, leaving open the door for that analogy to be doubted too.
Yeah, we wouldn't really know about the morality of God. And I don't know, well, what? I mean, so, look, there are moves to make here. There are actually, there's a whole class of moves. Actually, you mentioned Elizabeth Burns coming in here. There's a class of moves you can make God a limited being. You can make him not all powerful. It's hard to not want to make him all good. So let's just make him less powerful. And so he's trying to help us out. He or she is trying to help us out, but he can't do any better. Okay, I can't disprove that God. I mean, my idea was that there was this interesting, if you went for the God of traditional theism, all good and all powerful, then a contradiction emerges, given our morality. It wouldn't emerge for the limited God. But it's kind of, when you look at the way these limited gods are hypothesized, they're hypothesized just where we would want God to prevent the evil. The God doesn't have the power to do so. So it's a little bit kind of, I would always say, question begging about how you did this. You've defined the God such that he just can't do the things you think he ought to do. a whole range of those things. And so then he's off the hook with respect to being immoral, because he doesn't have the power to do any better. I don't know what we need a God like this for. I mean, I don't. But I mean, the all good, all powerful God was something to kind of be interested in and hope for. But these limited gods, I mean, they kind of went the way of the world with the Greek gods and the Roman gods and all the, you know, we got to one, sort of. Well, the Hindus never did get to one, but I mean, other groups got to one, and the Chinese widely stayed away from any in a certain way. Instead of kind of real wisdom in the Chinese way of looking at this whole thing. That's why they had the longest civilization, maybe. Right? I don't know. But anyway, so this is just an argument about one kind of God, which is kind of prevalent in the West and elsewhere in Middle East, or West, and yes, won't work.
It is the dominant view. So to be fair, while I said initially at the outset that I'm really sympathetic to what the argument that Jim is putting forward, but I try to make as much as I can and bring about critical points of views to bear. Hopefully this hasn't been biased. But having said that, it's time for me to also say what I like about the argument. The first thing that I like about the argument is that it also works as an anti-theodicy. There has been attempts to formulate some sort of anti-theodicies by Nick Trakakis, by also Andrew Gleason that I mentioned in our personal communication in his book A Frightening Love. And the interesting thing in Jim's work, I think, is that he takes the anti-theodicy, makes it mature enough because of the moral considerations, and he extends it to the logical case. So what I want to ask you is this: do you think that the logical problem of evil is ultimately a moral question or an existential one? Because the resistance of philosophers to allow, as you mentioned it initially, that there was some sort of resistance to allow these kind of considerations from ethics to come in. They are like, maybe we should make a difference between the intellectual problem of evil and the existential one. And maybe if we allow, if we allow these rights and consider it with freedom and the morality that you are saying and joining your argument, maybe that just creates the existential moral, the existential problem of evil. So do you think at the end your argument is a moral one, or should we say that no, it's not in its entirety, but at least it has been motivated by a moral concern?
Well, it is motivated by a moral concern, but I'm never quite sure what to make of this distinction between an existential form of evil as opposed to maybe a theoretical one. Using Gleason as an example here, I'm not clear. I haven't really read through the book thoroughly, but his idea of God being loving, just don't know what to make of that. I mean, loving to me is a moral notion, but he seems to be using it in sort of like it's kind of like following out your urges or something. I mean, it's something like you're driven to do something, and I'm not quite. I mean, that could be passion, maybe, if they kind of love, I suppose. I'm not sure if you put that, that's the characteristic of God. Now, he uses the word loving because that's already kind of moral connotation. You go back to Aquinas, loving means willing the good of another. I mean, that's a very moral notion, but he's trading on that a little bit. But then he's got something kind of like a forced notion of God does this thing with impelled to do this. So I don't know what they can make it. I think the way I would classify that view is he's again proposing a kind of limited God. It's a God that has this urge that it causes problems for us, but that's the best God can do with it. And so, we have to face the consequences. So I don't know what to do there with that. I mean, the way I understood the existential problem of evil was that, when somebody was really suffering from something terrible that's happened to themselves or someone close to them. For us to come in there and start talking about the problem of evil and whether there's possible justifications is not the right approach. There you want to deal with trying to console someone who is suffering very intensely and try to help them through it emotionally, comfort, show them you're there. That's really different from what philosophers are doing here. But it's the two things are not unrelated. Because, when you watch people in that suffering situation and they use things, well, they're better off in the afterlife, or they're better off now. I've gone to many funerals where this is the main theme. And I'm thinking, no, unless you had a bad life, things at the end, there's no more you. And so I hate to see this kind of untruthful consoling being the way we cope with life. I would rather us to live the truth on this. I think we could develop interesting ways of comforting each other, realizing that we're all there is, and there is no afterlife, and there is no God who's going to help us out or make it all fine. And so, but when you're dealing with people who have these visions of this God is going to help them, you can't be telling them that either. You have to still console them. But at some level, there is a better way at this, both at the existential level, at the theoretical level. I think I'm going to be able to probably experience both of this at some time soon. I'm going to coming to the end of my life at some point, and I'll see how that all goes existentially. And but I think I'm happy in some sense. I really thought through this thing thoroughly, and I'm still thinking through it thoroughly. I'm still listening to people and trying to see, did I miss something? Is there some better way of putting it? And it's theory and existence coming together here. In my case, it's coming together because they're coming close together here pretty soon. So I'm hoping they have a happy ending together. Although it may not be so happy because that'll be the end of me if I'm totally right. Of course, you get to the other side and the guy said, "Way, here I am, buddy. What have you been doing all your life?" Well, that'll be an interesting revelation. But of course, I've never heard anybody come back to tell me anything like that. I don't know what.
Right, and the whole point is to understand it right now before. So, one final thing that I wanted to say with regard to what I like about Jim's approach is there is, as I mentioned, a relatively new approach to axiology of theism, and Klaus Cry has this a book out on axiology of theism, and within it, basically, there is a race between the non-theist and the theist to say which conception could in principle secure more amount of goods, more than the other conception. And what I like about Jim's take on this is its axiological implication. So one of its axiological implication is that, logically speaking, I think one can cash out his arguments in an axiological format that, look, given theism, you cannot have secured all the goods that there should be. So that's a really interesting, I think, axiological consideration. And the only time I've heard you in that conference that Liz and others were in the axiological conference, and really shortly you just said, given my logical concerns with the existence of God, I'm not sure if I want to enter the domain of the axiological debate, because the axiological debate just asks, wouldn't it be better for one person or for everyone God existed or not. So, and I think one of these your criticisms and your central view kind of really plays nicely in the literature. So, what do you think of this literature?
Well, this is interesting. And see, there is an issue here that I have to address, and I do to some extent, and I want to address it more. Is this is an issue that is raised by William Lane Craig. It's basically that, and if you don't have a God, you don't have a foundation for morality. And he doesn't quite want to be divine command theorist on this, but the question is, if you say there's no God, what's the foundation for morality? And I have to address that. And the basic way I would like to do it is to think about, I've worked out this justification of morality, and what's my ultimate principle? Well, it's kind of good argument or non-question begingness. From that, I can get morality, and from morality, I can get equality eventually. But what's the grounding for this principle? And I think what you have to think of it like is, if there's something of value, doesn't it have to be made? Doesn't God make values? I mean, where are they coming from? But so I think the way to think about it is, does God make 2 + 2 = 4? And I think the answer is no. I mean, there's just 2 + 2 = 4. It's kind of a truth that's there, and morality to me is something like that. Now, how do we do this? Well, if you moved up in morality, I think the most ultimate principle of morality, before you get to the principle of rationality of non-question making, the ultimate principle of morality is treat relevant interests fairly. Treat all relevant interests fairly. And from that principle, I think you can get, a human morality, and you can get a biocentric morality, because some of the interests are going to be interests of non-human living beings. So it's take all the interests and treat them fairly, all the relevant ones. And then and that principle itself is derivable from the principle of non-question begingness, because in one sense, what non-question begingness does is treat all arguments fairly and get a fair result. And that's the non-question begingness. So now it seems to me that those principles and that principle of morality is true whether anything exists or not. I mean, they're just, I mean, if there's no God and there was no creation, it would still be 2 + 2 = 4. So now I want to think more about that, but that's my answer to kind of Craig's thing about, we need a foundation for morality. Well, do we need a foundation for 2 + 2 = 4? I mean, there is maybe a few more axioms above that, but then there they are, and that's it. And then you get the conclusions from that. So that's the axiology that's behind my view. I have to look into this axiology of theism book you mentioned. I have to look into that a little bit more.
I think what a fantastic addition that would be. So as you were laying out your criticism of the view of Adam in wishing away friendship or not, I was thinking in terms of the legal arguments when it comes to bystanders and enablers. And I was thinking to myself, would the existence of enablers and bystanders would be a good thing in a world or a bad thing? So this isn't something that I have worked on a bit. I'm starting to work on. But anyway, this could be a really interesting opening, I think, for some of your considerations, because they can really play a strong role in the axiology literature, I think. But one last thing that I wanted to ask you is this. and I have to ask this. Given the unfortunate, I'm not completely sure if I would go with unfortunate, but at least in my mind, not as fortunate as I would like it to be. The neo-atheism. What do you think of them? And what do you think of their work? And do you see anything in their work that is good, if any? And also, yeah, what is your general view on them?
Well, I mean, look, they, in one sense, I take them to be a consequence of a historical episode, and basically 9/11, and you know, they provided an opening for people to be critical of religion in a visceral way, and then they wanted to expand. Well, it's just not the radical Muslims here that we're against. We're against all religions. So, but see, I mean, there are problems to talk about the failures of religion and religions, and then you can talk about the successes of religion, things they've done well and things they've done badly. And they were kind of forced into this because they didn't have a logical argument. I wish to watch these debates in the early. It seems like we've passed through this period in a way. I'm hoping to kind of provide another resurgence at another level, but you would always get this situation where I remember Peter Singer maybe getting caught in this. Or somebody, and maybe William Lane Craig doing the other side of this. Well, can you have an argument to show that God is logically impossible? And then they have, no, I don't have it. Oh, so he's possible, you know. And so then we're finished now almost. I mean, you've lost everything. So they all had to do that. They didn't think that they had an impossibility argument. And then you had to get into the nitty gritty about when things have gone bad with religion and when things got bad. And they did overstate that by far. And I don't know what to say about what I thought what they needed was to focus on just what I'm focusing on. That is the logical argument, and show that, you know, we don't have to go into the errors of religion or the successes and do a weighing process here. We just have to show that it can't be logically possible for there being all good, all powerful God, given the evil in the world. So, but of course, this is all, you know, in the backdrop of this was Mackey's failure to provide a logical argument. I mean, I don't know if they knew what was going on in philosophy when the new atheists, but that was the backdrop. There wasn't anything to do there. So we were all in probabilities, examples, weighing evidence, and rhetoric. How could you build up good rhetoric on this? And I'm listening to now as a really interesting guy. I'm listening to things on both sides of this issue. This is Eric Mektas. I've never heard of him before. Is atheism dead? He actually talks about the new atheists, and he just says that they're in it. They're rhetoricians. They're no good intentions. It was just bad from the beginning. And I mean, okay, so they go back and forth this way, and I'm thinking, well, what about my argument? You know, what could that be? What would you do with it? Now, I have raised this argument and said, well, with certain people who are kind of in this public domain like this. I never heard of him before, but people like William Lane Craig. I said, well, could we have a debate? And I really tried many ways to get him to debate, and he's told me, he said he's no longer working on the problem of evil. So that's why he can't debate me. He's doing other things. So I'm thinking, I look back at those fantastic debates. He won because he's good on rhetoric, and he and he did this thing about what's the cause of what's the foundation for morality, and you can't prove there's no God. And I mean, it all rhetorically worked very well. And so, and he knows I'm trying for this other argument, but I haven't been able to get him on the table on this. I did. Who is? Well, that was very interesting. These people that are doing the limited God argument. I mean, God's not a moral agent. Huffling is really happy to do this. We've done it. We're going to do it again. I mean, that's really nice. I have reached out to some of the more popular people. They don't seem willing yet. I don't know what to say about them. I don't know what to say. I've not reached out to this fellow. I'm not sure what I'm trying to figure out what's the costs and benefits of doing that. But yeah, it's a continuing process here. I'm learning from it day by day on this, and it's exciting to be working with. And I really have enjoyed this discussion with you. I mean, I'm utterly surprised that this is coming out of Iran at this historical juncture. I couldn't believe it. I from up to the last minute, I think it's going to be canceled. It's going to be canceled. It's not going to happen. And then I see you're one of the most informed persons on this topic I've been discussing these things with. You're very good at this, and you reach out in lots of different contexts. I really admire what you've done, and I think it's a great thing, and you've helped me think about this. Yeah, I'm very appreciative.
I should say this is beyond belief high praise coming from someone with your status and your standing. This is unbelievably high praise. Thank you so much for your time. This has been really interesting.